The medical horrors of slavery. During the transatlantic slave trade between 1445 and 1870, approximately 400 years ago, Africans had been seen by their captors as non-human objects who had absolutely no human rights nor dignity. This resulted in terrifying physical and psychological harm done unto them, which is the basis of this video, where I will expatiate on the medical implications of just some of their extreme ordeals. Do subscribe to this channel for your lifelines. To drive home this point, there is a picture at the Nigerian coastal town and local government of Badagry Slave Port Museum, which shows a slave stabbing himself to death as he is being captured by European slave traders. Death was better than slavery. Families were separated. Wife, mother, husband, father separated from the children and from each other. Children had neck chains around their necks, just like the adults, and suffered unquantifiable psychological damage because they were savagely separated from their families and, indeed, handed over as bonus tips to the slave buyers. I told you, physical and psychological trauma was the order of the day. Like commodities, their eyes, their teeth, and other body parts were inspected in an inspection room, setting up the stage, yes, for the commencement of psychological torment for these slaves for hundreds and hundreds of years to come. 40 human beings? Yes, 40 human beings, men, women, children, crammed in tiny slave cells in a room like this with a tiny window for 4 miserable months, packed like sardines. It was in these tiny rooms, about 3 meters by 3 meters, with usually only one small window near the ceiling for ventilation, that these crowded 40 men, women, and children ate, drank, and slept in their excrement. Yes. Not only that, mind you, many died from malaria, and one can just imagine the types of diseases they suffered from in these unfathomable sanitary conditions. Without a toilet or other sanitary facilities, or many died before even getting on the ships to be carried across the Atlantic. An iron muzzle like that in this picture was attached to their mouths by piercing the upper and lower lip, and a padlock applied to prevent them from eating enough food for for fear that the slaves would get enough stamina to revolt against their captors. Hunger, starvation. So, while locked in there, sometimes for months, awaiting purchase by these slave masters, who were on their way on those grand ships, many of them had already had their spirits broken. This period of imprisonment under such cruel conditions would break even the most bravest captive spirits. Well, that is, if they survive. When it was time to board the slave ship, or cargo ship, as the ships were called, of course, human cargo ships, the slaves were then taken out of the jails and chained by their necks and ankles together and trekked that long distance in a single file, well, except, of course, for the children who were chained to their mothers. Misery, misery, as they walked that long, dirty path to no return, or the journey to the unknown destination. Sometimes a kilometer or more on this sandy path. It was difficult because of the heat and the deep sand. For the captives, it would have been 100 times worse. Weakened by their captivity, they were carrying the extra weight of the chains that bound them together, and the fear and the despair they must have felt. They were then made to drink from an enchanted well, known as the Spirit Attenuation Well. The Spirit Attenuation Well. In order so that they may become submissive. That's what the story says. Then they were made to chant lines saying that they were leaving their land forever and that they were never, ever to come back. So this human cargo in hundreds had their hair shaved and their clothes removed on deck, further destroying their psyche. They were then shoved into 4.5-inch compartments in severe heat, mind you, because of lack of ventilation. Below deck, yes, below deck, placed in such a manner that they wouldn't be able to talk to one another. That is social ostracization, you may say. Again, they relieved themselves where they were. Urine, sweat, excrement, diseases like malaria, yellow fever, smallpox, measles, diarrhea, dysentery, riddled their bodies and spread throughout the ship. Believe it or not, living slaves were thrown overboard to drown, yes. Death by drowning surely has to be one of the most horrifying ways to die. Don't you think? I think so. They danced and sang for their captors as entertainment while on the ships. These enslaved captives, well, some of them were deemed disobedient And what was done? Yes, they were beaten. Beaten severely. Do you know the object known as speculum oris? Well, speculum oris is a medieval metallic tool that was used to force open their mouths to eat the meal of rice and beans when they went on a hunger strike. Wow! Neck lock chains were applied for up to 4 months round their necks before arriving at this unknown destination. Yes, this was the average period they spent on shore, 4 months before they arrived. Enslaved captives deemed disobedient were beaten severely with a whip called Cat of Nine Tails, because this whip had the ability to inflict maximum pain. Imagine 4 months of this, not counting the 4 or more months of incarceration in the barracoon. Yeah, the barracoon was that little tiny slavery. That is another term for that. Women were left unshackled, of course, to satisfy the sexual urges of the crew. They were raped and sexually abused. They were demoralized completely. And yes, can you believe this? They arrived in the New World carrying the babies of their attackers. Yes. Rebellious slaves went through a number of punishments. Iron shackles, called manacles, were used to chain the ankles of 2 slaves together to further make their work even more difficult, while being forcibly attached to one another while working on the plantation, the sugarcane plantation, that is. An iron drilling bit poked into red-hot fire was used to brand their slave masters' names on their chests. Yes. This same instrument was used to punish runaway slaves by drilling into their toes, or just straight away chopping off their toes to prevent escaping again, causing permanent damage to the feet in many instances. Wow. They were hung on gallows with chains round their waist and left to slowly die. Of course, they never lasted more than a day. Other slaves were hung nearby, of course, so that they could watch the punishment. So that it could serve as a warning to others. And do you know that to deprive them the opportunity of committing suicide by drinking alcohol or suffocation, these slave masters applied metal masks over their faces with only small holes around the mouth? Massive, and I mean massive, metal neck and wooden slave collars with long spikes were placed on their necks. They were so heavy that if you fell, it would drag and snap your neck right off. Massive, heavy chains hung round their necks and their waists and wrists to emasculate and restrain those stubborn slaves. Yeah, those stubborn slaves needed to be dealt with, right? Pieces of flesh tore off from their bodies as they were being whipped. They were being whipped. Physical and psychological torture. Others would die because they bled so much from their wounds. Other slaves would be instructed to cut off the hands of other slaves with blades, of course, and they'd be left to bleed to death. Yes. Piercing and hanging from the hook. Yes. An incision would be made on their chests. A hook would be inserted through the wound, and the slave would be made to suspend from the wall, and he was hung, slowly dying, and then, of course, finished off by whipping. Can you see this picture? This illustration shows the cotton screw hanging technique. So what happens is, this cotton screw, while attached to the slave, was attached to a horse, and as the horse trotted round, the slave was dragged to death because of his or her injuries. What other things did we see then? The thumb screw, also called the thumbkin. This was a torture instrument with protruding studs, which was used to slowly crush toes and the thumbs of these revolting slaves. Neck lock chains were applied for 18 hours at the workplace at the sugarcane plantation to make them just a little bit more submissive. What about those mouth clips? Yes, those mouth clips were used to lock the mouth to prevent the slaves from eating that sugarcane while working on the plantation. It was so much, but no, don't eat our sugarcane. That iron drilling bit, do you remember it? That was used to drill holes on the lips for applying those face-tin masks. Yep, that drilling bit. Recaptured slaves would have these tin masks applied over their faces, and they were asked to carry out despicable things. This would drive them to suicide eventually, of course. And that was the end of them. What else? Others were beaten or burnt for not completing their daily quota on the plantation, of course. Others were strangled to death. Some had scars, permanent scars. It's quite nasty. Please, let's be extra kind to one another always. Let's remember the past so we don't repeat the same mistakes again that our forefathers did and made. Happy Independence Day, Nigeria. Subscribe to this channel, like, share, and comment. This is your lifeline.